Welcome to the Bikeshed podcast, where we talk about all things software engineering, food, vacations, and keyboards. I'm your co-host, a gargoyle of Golang, CSS obsessed, and HTML honor roll student, Scott K. And alongside with me are my co-hosts. His longest relationship was his Git log history. He commits to prod more than any TV series. He's not here to argue, just resolve conflicts. Matt Hamlin. And my other co-host, the man who never simmers down, Dylan Spicy Take Curry. Fellas, what's on our agenda today?
Another solid intro, Scott. Today we're talking about all about React server components, RSCs. They've been a thing maybe for 5 years now, I think. I was actually going to go back and kind of look at some of the commits in the React repo to see like when they started doing some of the early experiments for it. But I think it's like coming up on 5 years. I mean, some of the early stuff like Suspense was 2016, so that's like almost 10 years, which is kind of wild to think about. Today we want to talk about React server components. We might talk about Next. Next is sort of like the de facto implementation for RSCs, but maybe we save that for a spicy take.
We're talking about Next, baby.
Before we get into it, Matt, I just want to give a shout out to one of our listeners, Will. He's been saying that my takes are too spicy, so I'm going to tone it down this week.
Perfect. That's what we needed. Yeah.
Dylan, Sleepyhead Curry.
I think it's fitting that you guys are both like sipping on coffee, and I've been awake for 3 hours now.
This is coffee with ghost chili powder, so yeah.
There you go.
You seem the most awake too, Matt.
I don't know how, but yeah.
You got code running through your veins.
Scott, you had sort of thrown this topic into our discussion channel that we have for these recordings. Curious, like if you want to provide some background on like why you thought RSCs would be a good topic for us to dig into this week.
Yes. I think this would be a unique topic for us because we all have some experience with this. We will probably get into this, but we did this at Wayfair, the three of us. We also we did this at Wayfair, the three of us, but it was not very easy to get to the end result. I don't know if RSC was necessarily the culprit that made it hard, but I want to get into that a little bit. And we also did this at Fireworks, Matt and I, where it was a lot more of a streamlined process to get to done, and things were a little bit more fleshed out. So at Airbnb, they're talking about, or folks are talking about trying to get us to React server components. We want to talk about, are they worth it? What's the benefit we get from it? Is there a true benefit? How do you take a mono repo or a giant code base, migrate it over to React server components?
Yeah, and I think, and like, it's not just, Dylan's experience wasn't just at Wayfair. I think that at Whoop, you guys are also leaning a little bit into some server components. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
Maybe we can dig into this as we get more into the topic, but I think there's a little bit of like people glance at the documentation about like, this is a server component. All right, that's all I need to know. That kind of made sense. And they just start trying to integrate it into their code base. And they don't really know what they're doing. I'm kind of self-reporting, but I've seen this at my org as well, where people are just like, it seems like we need this. Let's try to use it. And I feel like things are feeling a little bit like discombobulated because we're not using it correctly. We're holding it wrong.
You're holding it wrong. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so something I will want to dig into is at Wayfair, we migrated over what was a CSR app to be an SSR app with server components, right?
Well, it was like we supported server-side rendering for a number of different pages already.
Right,
so
but
we
the
were
pages
migrating
on
that.
Next.js we currently had over were CSR, right? The
No,
category page was CSR.
No, it was client-side rendered, or server-side rendered, rather. Sorry.
Well, we did a lot of work to change services. Those services were just being migrated to
Well,
GraphQL. I thought they were also, well, some of it was SSR'd through Express, right? But the app itself was still client-side rendered in Next 12, not until Next 13. We didn't truly have SSR hydration again, right? I thought we.
Well, okay, yeah. I mean, it might be worth talking about, like, yeah, so our migration at Wayfair, we before we adopted Next, sort of like, if we go way back, we were using like a home rolled server-side rendering service
Correct.
for applications, and then and that was like built on Express and like an internal library that handled SSR for us. Really just calling React, what is it, React DOM render string or whatever, and that like integrated with a PHP layer. As soon as we started to like look at adopting Next, that was like sort of before Next had supported server components, or like they were starting to experiment with it, but primarily the pages router in Next, which is like the pages directory, was like the only way you build apps. So that supported like Git server-side props and things like that. And so our initial adoption of Next was using Git server-side props in the pages router for some early pages. We tried to experiment early with server components, in 2021, I think. But there were just like a few other blockers. It wasn't like fully baked, didn't really work yet. But we talked to the team at like the Next.js team and even like talked to some of the React maintainers also about it, and just to get their perspectives on how we build that out. I think it wasn't until 2023 that we started to actually say, okay, server components are viable, like for us to start adopting, like viable for us to adopt in production. And we started to do the migration to the app router, which is like server component enabled for early pages.
So we should talk about how we adopted them, but I want to dig a little bit deeper here because I was under the guise that, or maybe I should talk about this first, but I remember we lost, so we used to flush the header, basically inline things, so the header would load faster. This is something we lost when we adopted Next 12 with what I thought was CSR rendering. And when we were migrating back to Next 13, we wanted to get that back with server components and streaming. That was a big push, but also how did we look at the difference between the speed in which and performance we gained from Next 12 to Next 13, and like I guess what were the differences between what we server side rendered and what we client side rendered?
Yeah, so I guess like, and maybe first we back up a little bit just for maybe folks that might be unfamiliar with RSC, or find like a little bit confusing to balance like CSR, SSR, RSC, like how they all interact.
Sure.
So like for the longest time, Wayfair had been a like strongly sort of server side rendered application. Like it just like sort of the trade-offs of supporting SSR, like even when we were using PHP and like mustache templates before we adopted
Right.
React, we were server-side rendering for the performance of it, right? So like we could deliver a page before client-side JavaScript booted up. We adopted React. We also adopted server-side rendering for React. We adopted Next. We leaned into server-side rendering for Next with like the pages router, like we were saying. One of the things though, before we adopted Next, like one of the things we heavily optimized within our PHP setup at Wayfair was like a rough streaming implementation that would flush down the header, like Scott was saying. It's like the top navigation on the page, and then flush down the rest of the page after. So that way we could like start showing something on the user's browser before the whole page is ready to be shown. We lost that in Next because like in the pages router, there wasn't a way to like say like, hey, like flush this chunk first and then flush the rest of the page later. And that's just like a fundamental sort of limitation of sort of the synchronous server-side rendering that Next uses. Yeah. In the sense that you can fetch data asynchronously, but then like the actual server rendering, like rendering out the React tree to HTML, is a synchronous process at that point. And so that's like that's a feature we launched with that regression on some pages, just to like, because we were getting other benefits out of using Next, and just in terms of like other performance vitals outside of like time to first byte. And so like our like interest in adopting server components was primarily for the incremental streaming that we get out of like, or like that React sort of like offered that as a capability with RSC. You could have done incremental streaming before RSC in React, but Next.js didn't support it. And so that was kind of like our constraint there.
I guess the thing I'm trying to find out is, and you two were there a little longer than me, what are the performance benefits or wins we actually saw from the two differences in migrating from like server-side rendered to server-side rendered in that case?
Or you mean like migrating from our previous setup to Next, or from Next pages
From
router to app router?
Well, I guess I'd be interested in both, but pages to app would be the more linear, but I guess at the same time, all irrelevant.
Yeah, this
Like
feels like I'm in
basically,
an interview. This is great.
what did we get from React server components? Like, was there clear benefit?
Yeah, the primary benefit, I guess, at that point in time was to unlock that streaming rendering, right? Like we could flush the header,
Correct.
we could
It did
flush the
flush it
top half
again.
of the page, we could flush the bottom half of the page, we can flush the footer, right? So we can do this like sort of chunk up the page. And like primarily that's because like we had more maybe like heavier features, if you can call it like that, like the features that depend on more data or hit a service that's a little bit more difficult to compute the data that you need. Deeper down on the page, right? So it's like relatively easy to flush some of the stuff at the header just because we've heavily optimized that over the years. But the features in the page itself are usually like a little bit more difficult to collect the data for and render just because they're more complex. And so like the incremental streaming gives us the ability to sort of like break that work out, do it sort of later in the request cycle. Like when we were there, like when we moved to Next, our time to first byte, like that performance vital, the web vital, is the thing that took the most hit when we first went to the pages router, just because we didn't do that streaming. Right, our time to first byte was
Correct.
waiting until the entire page was ready to flush before we get that first byte. When we adopted app router, that time to first byte went like sort of right down to the ground, like pretty instant in terms of like being able to flush the header and then like get the first byte there basically as soon as possible.
I feel like we're getting like super far into the history of Wayfair's journey into like server components, and I feel like your understanding of this is like advanced in a way, like like more about this than the average developer. So I'm like kind of hoping maybe we can step back a little bit and talk about this from the standpoint of like what is a typical developer's understanding of Next.js, and like how are they using RSCs, and also like kind of get Matt's take on like what's the fundamental understanding people should have before they start implementing them into their apps. I don't want to like completely derail you from your history lesson, but I feel like some of what you're saying is going over my head. So I want to like I'm afraid that people listening are probably feeling the same way.
It also like it's what I've been talking about is basically only interesting or valuable to the like 3 or 4 listeners that still work at Wayfair.
All right, keep talking about it. Those are our only listeners, anyways.
Well, what I really wanted to try to get out of it is like, what can you expect to gain from using React Server Components? I did remember. It's funny. I don't know how you remember this. It's been so long. You were. It's obviously been branded in your head. But like for me, you brought up the time to first byte, and then I'm like, oh yeah, it was abysmal. And then I remember our interaction at Next Paint was abysmal at first as well. So basically, yeah, I wanted to kind of dig deep on that, but I do think it's important, like you're saying, Dylan. We should run through like uh, React Server components at a high level as well.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more general purpose things, right? Like why, if you have a React app today, maybe you're using like a vanilla like V8 React app that's client-side rendered, or maybe you're still using Create React app and you're wondering how like where you go from there. Like why would you want to consider adopting server components? I think that's an interesting like general topic for us to talk about. Like I think one of the benefits I've seen from it is like it lets you sort of, and people might look at this and say like that's a bad idea, but it lets you like kind of couple your back end with your front end a little bit more, right? Like a lot of teams that are maybe more sort of have worked a lot with code bases that are really separate from their back end to their front end. I think RSCs gives you a nice way to like say like my front end cares about this data, and it's like a lot more tight coupling than GraphQL is probably the closest thing to it in a sense of like here's the exact data that this front end component cares about, RSCs let you do that same thing without needing to use GraphQL. If you don't want to use GraphQL, you still can use GraphQL with it, but you don't have to. So I think that's like a nice benefit, is like a better sort of cohesive view of your application and like data dependencies that you have for your components. But I think, like we were talking about with like Wayfair's case, it's like there are some additional like performance or like web vital benefits of doing of adopting RSCs. Primarily, I think from the streaming aspect of like being able to flush incrementally your web page.
Yeah, those all make sense. I assumed also a big part of it is to try to have like smaller client side bundles with solutions. Things like, if I remember correctly, don't we get automatic code splitting from React Server components? And also, if we server render HTML, that provides like an SEO benefit. Those are the things that I could think of off of hand. But
Yeah, I mean, like the server rendering itself, like technically you can adopt RSCs without server rendering, which is like,
okay,
I think at this point it's mostly just a technicality. It's like kind of like a thing that the React team sort of sells as a concept, but it like very few implementations that I've seen in the wild like use RSCs without also server rendering. Um, it's just sort of like you already have a server that's doing this stuff. Like, why not also server render? Is basically at least the way I've internalized the concept. But like, so you don't. So like from that lens, like the benefits of server rendering aren't always the same things as using RSCs, but sometimes they come packaged together. I guess the way to describe it.
sure.
Matt, when you say using RSCs without server rendering, are you saying like using RSCs to get all of your data on the server and then pass it to client components and then do all your rendering on the client with that data? Is that like kind of what you're getting at?
Basic, Basically, yeah. You client side render an app, and that app fetches from an RSC endpoint. So instead of usually like you would fetch and you would get some JSON, like you actually fetch and you get like a RSC payload, which is like sort of it's a custom data type basically that React can then parse and then hydrate some HTML from.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you're not passing the data down from the component to component. You're just like you have your RSC there as sort of an API endpoint through a server action or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. I mean, it's but you don't necessarily, in that setup, you wouldn't necessarily sort of use that response and pass it to client components in order to render. You sort of like, that response is like, it's almost like you're dumping like HTML into a client component, but not necessarily using it as props for a client component. Like you don't get back, obviously, like, like with a JSON API, you might fetch something like a light count or something like that and gives you back a number. Whereas with this, like it gives you back a sort of a RSC rendered, so like a thing that looks like could be translated into HTML of like the counter for the likes or whatever. Um, so that's like maybe an interesting distinction. But I think there's like a number of different other benefits from RSCs, but I think like an interesting sort of like we're covering some of the benefits, but it's like there's some like trade-offs with adopting RSCs, like as with every solution, right? Like there's fundamentally, like one of the maybe the big ones for a lot of React developers out there is that you need a server layer, right? Like a lot of React apps today don't use server-side rendering. Like they're completely client-side rendered. They started with Create React App or Vite or whatnot, and so they didn't need a server for any of that. They obviously have like a CDN or something serving those assets, but no actual like sort of server processing going towards the React app. It's like probably all for the back end. So like you need to adopt something like that. Generally speaking, I mean, you can do build time RSC, which is like your server is your build server, but yeah, you don't necessarily get in that setup you don't really get server side rendering. You get sort of like what static site generation sort of approach with RCs.
So we talked a lot about starting anew with React Server components. Something I wanted to facilitate early was, can we talk about adopting it in a code base that already exists? And I guess this is more of an interview for Matt. What are your thoughts on some of that? What's an approach for something like that, especially maybe uh, you know monorepo architecture, I guess multiple mono repos, poly repos, whatever you want to say here. How would you go about taking an application that's already server-side rendered, and with maybe some internal solutions, maybe some open source solutions, and migrate it towards a React server component architecture?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the bigger questions around RSC these days is like, how do you adopt it? Very early on, the story of adoption for React was that you can do it from the leaf nodes up, right? Like I remember watching a lot of talks about it, like saying like, you can replace your, backbone powered application with React incrementally, sort of like working your way up the tree. I think one of the things that you can't easily do with RSCs is you can't really do that. You could technically you could do it, but generally the thinking is that RSCs sort of want you to like flip the mental model of how you adopt React. Like you start from the server and you work towards the client. Whereas normally it's like a client sort of up to the server sort of approach. You can kind of see this obviously in like Next implementation, where it's like every page starts as a server component and you have to opt into it being a client component with use client. So I think that's like an interesting pain point with an existing app migrating to RSC, is that you can't easily swap out a small little subsection of your page with an RSC, right? Like you sort of need to start at the top and work your way down. I think if you already have server-side rendering set up, then you're kind of in a good spot because you already have a server, so you have some infrastructure to start building off of. If you don't have that set up, then it's like maybe a little bit more difficult to start moving to it. And another sort of pain point for legacy apps migrating to it is like, does their bundler support RSC? Like RSC is not necessarily a thing you can do without a bundler. So that's like another sort of complex pain point, right? If you're using a custom bundler, you're going to have to spend quite a bit of time building out your own RSC integration for it. Webpack supports RSCs. Vite loosely supports, you can kind of like hack it into Vite apps. Parcel now supports it. But outside of Parcel and Webpack, basically there's not really a bespoke like sort of solution for the rest of the bundlers out there. So I think that's like more maybe sort of like some of the initial pain points in terms of like how would you like what blocks a legacy app from adopting it. Maybe we talk a little bit about strategies of how we how you actually do that. Let's assume that you're using a bundler that supports it already. Let's assume you have some infrastructure for doing it during builds or from like server-side rendering. My recommended strategy is like start page by page, right? Like because that's the sort of the easiest place you can insert it, right? You start at an entry point, and you go page by page to adopt it, which is the same approach we took at Wayfair, right? Like we took a single page, we migrated it, and then we took another page, and we migrated it, etc. So I don't know. That's I feel like I've been talking quite a bit about it, but yeah.
One thing I want to call out is one thing I've seen when people start to adopt it, and I've seen myself do this, is you sort of adopt it at the top level in a single component per page, and then we kind of like get stuck there. We don't like really know how to integrate server components at different levels in the tree. I guess what's your recommendation to sort of better get our set our mindset correctly so we can start to do that?
That's a really good point. So I want to bring up at Wayfair, the three of us kind of were like, all right, we'll have some server components at the top. There'll be some client components that are our state providers within that tree. But we told like all of our feature consuming teams, you just got this one big, I think it was the page.tsx. You probably remember this, Matt. But we're like, you own this, or we created like a page.client.tsx, something like that. And we're like, you own this, and it's just one big client component. However, at Fireworks, I think we kind of were able to just work out when it should be a client component versus a server component, and it was mostly just driven by state. Let's have the state, and maybe this sounds obvious or clear, but like components that the state can be as close to the component it needs to be in, so that like client components can be drilled down as far as possible. And essentially that was kind of the pattern we used, and we migrated more towards server actions for form solutions and whatnot, so that we made sure that we were like using as much server benefit as we could at Fireworks. And I just want to also add, Matt definitely like understands this stuff the best. He helped really blueprint how we built this in a large space. I feel like with using Next.js, a lot of this has just been kind of handed to me and spoon fed. But I've also felt that there was never really like a clear paved path. I feel like they're building towards that now. Like Next will kind of say like, this is how you do a thing, this is how you do that thing. React has been very hands off in the sense they've been like, you kind of figure out the implementation you want, which I guess I understand from a perspective of they want to allow you to own that part and like the patterns for what you do. However, I guess I've been isolated more in the Next Vercel ecosystem where they're kind of like, this is the pattern, use this pattern. So it's been easier for me to apply those principles. Whereas when you're doing this for the first time and it's brand new back in 2023, I know you said React Server Components had been around, but them being introduced as like the main part of a framework, it was very new when we were starting to do it. It was very much figure it out. And the only real complication we ran into was Luke Reich realized that we had followed the GraphQL suggested pattern of attaching fragments to components as statics. And some of those components, if I remember correctly, were client rendered components. And that would break the bundle because they needed to be rendered server side. So we hijacked the typegen plugin we were using. We also had a ton of packages in our mono repo, which may have been different than how other people were building their fragments. Regardless, it caused us to have to like generate files for them to come out of, and basically making sure we didn't have server client mismatches like that. So my background is more so coming from a framework where I was a little bit more protected from that. But yeah, Matt, sorry, I derailed kind of where we were going with this, but to Dylan's question, whatever that might have been, go for it.
Yeah, that like one of the fundamental things with React Server Components is like you basically need to think about two environments when you're writing your application, right? You have a server environment, which is like server components, server functions, and then you have a client environment, like client components. And you can have client actions and things like that. But that's just like regular React, right? The client side of the React Server Component split is like basically your React app today if you aren't using RSCs, right? And so like that fundamental split is like the conceptual model that a lot of people are new to with React Server Components. And so like that, it takes a while to like figure out like, how do you use these two environments? How do you like properly stitch an app together?
I feel like it's something worth calling out that Matt's for sort of getting into is Next.js is like being given to all these front end engineers who are used to just working in a client side environment. And then all of a sudden they have all these controls to work on the server and they don't really have the experience with server like backend development. It's basically that's what you're doing. And so there's a lot of new considerations in terms of security as like the primary thing, but there's other things too where you need to like just think about like, is this going to be shared across different instances on the server? And you can cause like caching issues where you're sharing data across different customers, which can be really, really bad. And I don't think most engineers that are front end really consider that when they get thrown into an Next.js framework and they start working in server components. They're like, oh, what the hell's going on here? And
Yeah,
they can really start to
100%.
shoot themselves in the foot.
Yeah, I think you're nailing that. Like you and Matt kind of called about this is like you called out this is like the marriage of front end and back end and where we blur the lines.
Yeah.
Um, but like I also felt like deciding when we use a client component, sorry, just a quick point, reminded me of how do we use hooks in React. I remember we had like been like, oh, we don't want people to just use hooks everywhere, which ironically, maybe I don't remember correctly, but I didn't feel like hooks were crazy at Wayfair. I've seen client-side apps with crazy hooks. But like you kind of naturally develop where you think it's best. Like what do I want to server render versus what I want to client render, and like creating this large level paradigm. There might be some like basic building blocks to it, but less so that you need to have like defining guidelines around that.
I think it's also worth like noting, like, I think we got to be careful with our terminology also. Like, it's not that two concept thing of like server and client isn't necessarily meaning server rendered versus client rendered, right? You can have a server rendered client component, which again, this adds to the general confusion that a lot of people have with RSC. So it's like, I don't know if I'm doing justice in terms of like trying to explain it, because it's like it could be confusing. But like you have like, just because you choose a client component doesn't mean you're de-opting to client side rendered only, right? So I just wanted to like make sure that's clear for listeners,
Correct.
because it can be confusing, right? It can be like we call this a client component, but it's more of like a a presentational component versus a container component, for those that have remembered Redux from decades past, where you have like a container component that wraps presentational components. The container component handles data fetching or state management, and your presentational component just presents it, right? So it's very much that same mental model, if you're familiar with it, where your container components are server components and your presentational components are client components.
One thing you said is this is kind of it can get confusing, and I feel like a lot of people, when they're thrown into into Next.js, and they're given all these new features, they're just confused and they're misusing them. So I want to kind of like ask you, what can people do to like slow down the fire hose and step back and like take some time to get some better understanding before they start using these tools?
Yeah, something we were messaging on the side about this is like the blog post, or like the talk by Dan Abramov called React for Two Computers. I think that's a really good, like, from first principles sort of understanding of the mental model of these like two environments, right? Like it sort of talks about it from like building up from very basic concepts up to you have this server and client environment. So that's like a good like sort of fundamental starting point. I think it's also interesting to look at it like, obviously Next.js is sort of like the de facto industry leader in RSC right now, for better or worse. Sometimes it can be useful to look at alternative RSC frameworks just to understand that, like, what you use with Next isn't the React version of RSC. It's like the Vercel or the Next.js version of RSC, right? Like it's not necessarily that RSC, the implementation or the the standards, if you will, of RSC change. It's more so just like how is it leveraged within your framework of choice, right? So like parcels implementation is a lot more basic, but, and you can say not necessarily basic in terms of like doesn't provide or like doesn't support the same complexity as Next, but it's more so it like gives you the control over a lot of the same stuff that Next doesn't. Right, so parcels implementation, you need to provide your own server and handle the requests, right? So like you can adopt Express or Hono or whatever your favorite like sort of server routing framework is, and then hook into parcels implementation in order to like server render or like RSC, like render the RSC side of things or handle actions or whatnot. Whereas Next, that's all a black box, right? It's like Next handles that for you, and so yeah, I think that, like those two things like sort of that blog post or that talk by Dan Abramov is like a great starting point. And then also like starting to try to look at some of the other framework implementations, just to understand that like, there's things that are Next features and there's things that are RSC features. And that's like always good to break down.
I have a question. So if I remember correctly, with both server components are rendered on the server, client components are pre-rendered on the server and then hydrated on the client. Is that a full-on RSC concept, or is that just how they were working within Next?
Well, server components don't really get server rendered in the same way that a client component gets server rendered. Again, we're like digging into nuance here, but that Next.js generally follows the like sort of the setup of server side rendering everything, right? Like you can opt into client side render, but you can't do a client side rendered React server component. If that makes sense in Next.
Right, because it's server rendered first, unlike TanStack, which is like the opposite. It's client side first, so you'd have to opt in. It's client side opt
Right,
in.
yeah, but you can't with Next. You can't like you can't expose at least not out of the box. You can't expose like a server component like an API endpoint, like we were talking about earlier, where it's like you could technically have a client React app that fetches a server component and then renders it. Next doesn't really give you a native solution for that. Like that,
Right.
they sort of force you, like if you're using RCs, you're going to server side render or like, you could immediately opt out, but basically you can't really fetch from a client-side rendered app a server component in Next without some hacky solution. We've been talking a lot about Next. I just brought up Parcel, but like, yeah, Next and Parcel are not the only two places you can use server components. There's like a number of different like sort of esoteric options out there, but I think like in my mind, like the top four right now are Next obviously, but then Parcel's implementation is like kind of the next after Webpack, the next sort of stable implementation for server components. Like they have an integration within the React repo, and it's like sort of I don't know, for lack of better terms, like blessed by the React team. But then outside of those two, the next two that I would sort of like look at or recommend if people are interested is Waku, which we've talked about in the past a little bit, which is like a Vite-based server component framework. It's a little bit more baked than Parcel. Like it sort of comes with a default router and handles the server-side like sort of route matching for you. Where versus Parcel, you sort of need to do that by yourself. And then after those three is, and it's like still pretty new, so it's like not stable as much, as Redwood SDK, which is another Vite-based solution. And yeah, again, it's like pretty fresh. I've only like used it once or twice, so I don't have as much context about it. But like those four are sort of like the places that I would recommend starting with if you're starting with a fresh app. If you start like, if we talk about like sort of the legacy app migration, it's like it becomes a little bit more nuanced in terms of like what's your current bundler situation if you have one, what's your current server situation if you have one, and like what fits best there.
So, Matt, if I'm working in an Next.js app, do you still recommend that I go and spend some time learning about these other frameworks to get some better context around the topic? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, I recommend it no matter what. Like even if you're not using Next, it's like I think it's always interesting just to explore with what options are out there, right? But that's just like the way I sort of operate. I think it could be useful. Obviously, if you're using Next, like you probably want to just keep leaning into Next features, just because like switching cost of like I wouldn't recommend that people go out there and just decide to rewrite their app from Next to something else just on the whim, right? So like. You could look at those other options and say, actually, these are providing better trade-offs for us. But I wouldn't recommend that everyone go out there and rewrite their app from Next to Redwood SDK or Parcel, for example. There's trade-offs, obviously. It depends, as Scott's favorite saying.
So yeah, I wanted to bring up one other thing we did do is, so we knew the bundler situation. You basically prepped all of Wayfair for RSC. It's fair to say this was kind of your blueprint and plan. You delegated to so we had a monorepo for the design system. Essentially, you delegated to those folks that we needed to get a runtime solution for styles. We needed to mark the right components, use client. You also, how did you do that for the existing monorepo? Did you do that yourself, or did you actually tell teams, or was it that we set up basically a template as a team and you just set the parts to it as use client? How did you build out a template that was successful in a large scale monorepo?
That's a good question, yeah, because it's something we talked a little bit sort of like the two different sort of conceptual like sort of domains you need to think about with RSC, like server and client side, or client components, not client side. But it is RSC, because it sort of demands that you sort of start at your root and you work your way down. You do need, if you are working with a legacy app or like an existing code base, you need to think about how to migrate that over and make it compatible. Like Scott, you were touching on this with the GraphQL setup. Like our code base wasn't ready to just jump right into server components. We had to do a decent amount of work. Some of the patterns that we did is like, so the way we started at Wayfair was like basically, what I call the naive server component adoption strategy, where we have, basically two server components per page. One is the header, which fetches data for the header, and it has there's a header, presentational component or client component that renders the header. And then we did the same thing for the rest of the page, right? We had a page server component with page TSX and next. And then we had a client, like a sort of a sidecar client component that did all the rendering for the rest of the page, right? So very naive, just sort of two RSC component strategy sort of. And so that limited the blast radius of the impact, right? Like we didn't need to worry about some deep leaf component, adding use client to it because it uses a client API like use state, for example, because we already sort of accounted for that at the root. But yeah, as you were saying, like, before this, we had kind of loosely started to adopt style components in our component library, but then we moved that to vanilla extract. So that kind of like, gives a little bit of a benefit in terms of like being able to, generate styles at build time instead of at runtime, which is like works better with server components in Next versus like style components or other things in terms of like being de-opted to a client component. But yeah, in other places we basically had to like go around and find these cases where we needed to like add a use client because a component was being sort of like imported into a server component and was using a client API like use state or use ref or whatever it is. And the GraphQL topic that you were talking about, like how we composed fragments was also like probably the largest thing that we had to worry about, right? Like, yeah, the strategy we had used before is like you just sort of like accompany each component with its data fetching context, the fragment that it cares about. But we wouldn't be able to like sort of stitch those together into the server component because it would end up pulling in the client components along with it because they were statics. So we had to like work around that. And yeah, Luke and team did a great job in terms of like building out a sort of a simple implementation that allowed us to split that out easily, which is really nice. We could also talk about like our express layer, which is non-standard for most Next apps, but maybe we save that for the end if we want to dig into it.
I remember when we first got it together, I think our metrics were a little fucked, for the lack of a better term. We talked about INP, which was something Dylan had to introduce. We talked about time to first byte, although we brought that number down, if I remember correctly. And I think like largest contentful paint, first input delay, cumulative layout shift were on par. But if I remember correctly, you guys again were there a little longer than me. We ended up getting those numbers down. I don't want to put hard numbers on it, but we did see metric benefits at the end of the day in all areas, correct?
Yeah, our first once we fully adopted that server component strategy, even just that naive sort of two component setup, every measured web vital that we had, comparing our previous framework, which used sort of like a PHP backend and like a home rolled server side rendering setup, every metric for that versus the app router implementation on Next had improved. And so I think, I don't know, order or scale, magnitude or whatever, but I think everything there improved. I think some of that could have been just like, better bundler strategy in terms of like we're like sort of letting Next do the hard work for us in terms of bundling our code, or just like streaming rendering or anything like that is like sort of like there are too many factors at play, I guess, in order to like directly say like, just RSC adoption was the thing that made it better.
I'm gonna add. I keep coming back to like practical application for the listener. Like, what's a good way when people are implementing server components to keep track of like what sort of improvements they're hopefully seeing across the board on their application? And I think I have a pretty good answer for this, but I can give it a shot. And I think it's monitoring core web vitals on like a daily basis at a minimum. I think that's the way we did it at Wayfair. I'm currently not doing this at my current job, and I'm wishing that we had something like this set up. And maybe we do, and it's just not part of my workflow right now. But I'm also curious what you guys think about it.
Yeah, I definitely think monitoring web vitals is like, even if you're not using RSC, like it's something that most teams should probably start thinking about. Right, like web vitals is like at least from what I found, is like the best way to quantify like how good your user experience is or how bad your user experience is, right? Just like quantify your user experience, make it something that's measurable, and then you can start to see improvements from there. Yeah, I don't know, Scott, if you have any hot takes or opinions on like RSC performance or just general web performance or whatnot.
Every engineer should be concerned about the performance of their or impact on performance of what they're building. I don't think a team should just be dedicated to it. It needs to be, I guess, a cultural norm that you're not going to destroy performance, and that there are some sort of easy indicators for a team to be able to just see the impact of what they're building. So the guy who's building an epic client-side visual diff. But yeah, I do believe you need to find ways to do that.
Yeah. I mean,
Back
yeah.
back in my day. Sorry, go
No,
ahead.
well, I was gonna remark sort of generally on this episode is like it's kind of ironic that like maybe I'm talking the most about server components when I work at HubSpot and every single app that we maintain at HubSpot is client side rendered. Um, we've talked about potential like server component, like what a server component strategy would look like, but yeah, everything is client side rendered, so we don't even do server side rendering, and it's well, there's like a few places in the product that use server side rendering, but yeah, I don't know. It's kind of ironic that you guys are both like, Dylan, you're already sort of deep in server component land a little bit in terms of you guys are using Next. Scott, you guys are considering it, but yeah, I don't know. It's a little ironic in my mind because of that.
So since you're like, do you find that you're like the expert in server components where you're at? And I mean, maybe that doesn't really matter, but you see the importance of like what sort of benefits they can bring. Is it like in the back of your mind that a large goal of yours is to like introduce that into HubSpot in the future? And like, do you see that as being like accomplishable, I guess, with their current legacy applications?
I think maybe there's like a number of interesting variables at play. Like, sort of, I'm not necessarily on the team that maintains the framework side of our front end applications at HubSpot. So like that sort of provides a gap of like I'm not that closely related to that some of that work. Um, I think also like HubSpot has a very long tail of like we support sort of the long tail as opposed to like being more leaning and like sort of forward on like like instead of like it basically HubSpot would choose to maintain an existing system because thousands of apps depend on it versus start to POC a net new system for a initial like sort of small batch and then work our way out basically like the migration story here is like very like that's something that's like has to be considered for everything we do. It's like how do we migrate the existing apps that we support. So I don't know. It's yeah, maybe in the future, but at this point, it's like kind of hard to see us doing that in the near term, at least, unfortunately.
Do we want to talk at all about the express layer? Does it matter? We mentioned it. Should we just high level it?
Without necessarily needing to get into specifics, I think Next is nice, but it's as with most things that are like off the shelf solutions, they're not going to hit 100% of your use case. Right? Like at Wayfair, I think the primary reason we adopt Next was just because it was so popular and it was basically the only solution out there that sort of provided the things, some of the core things we care about. But with that, obviously came trade-offs of like it didn't give us all the flexibility we needed, and so we ended up needing to do some, hacks is maybe a way to say it, of like in order to support our use cases. Um, if we were in the same position, I doubt we would choose something other than Next just because of its market dominance. But like Parcel, probably like if Parcel had a solution 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we probably would have jumped on board Parcel, even if it meant a little bit more of a jump from our existing Webpack setup potentially. And I say that just because like Parcel gives us a lot more flexibility on the server layer versus Next, for example. But yeah, it's definitely like it depends sort of thing of like what are your trade-offs that you're willing to accept, and yeah.
I feel like if you're at a small enough company, you can kind of do whatever you want. Like if you only have 5 engineers at your entire company, it's like choose whatever tool everyone that you're working with is happy with. But at a larger company, you usually just have to adopt whatever is the industry standard or market, like has the most in the market because it's just going to be so much easier to hire people that have experience with it. And it's a little bit maybe that's we're hiring incorrectly if we're like, oh, you just need to have this specific framework experience, and we need to be hiring people more based on just like their ability to take any sort of tool and work well with it. So maybe I'm just like learning for myself on the spot that we need to be assessing people better.
Yeah. I think also like maybe we should do a whole episode on small company versus big company dynamics. I think it's that like sort of like I don't know. There's a lot of interesting things for us to talk about there. Like you were saying, Dylan, like a small company could probably pick something else, but it's like also that you have like sort of the competing demand of like you're small and you just want to ship your product ASAP, right? So it's like, um, yeah, I don't know. It's there's like interesting dynamics there, but yeah, maybe we save that for a following another episode in the future.
All I've felt is like we're very like we're using RSCs and we're some of us are using Next. We've used Next in the past. I'm just thinking of this from like the standpoint of a listener who just uses Ruby on Rails. Then they're just like so mad. They're just in their head. They're thinking, guys, if you just use Rails, you wouldn't have any of these issues. So it'd be crazy to bring in somebody who's an expert on that side of things and just like argue back and forth on why you should use one versus the other and see what we can learn from each other.
Yeah, I think it would be an interesting perspective. Um, Yeah, yeah. I think maybe I think we've like sort of covered the majority of the main topic, but I think just like for me, like one of the closing notes is like I think Scott, you were alluding to this. Like I think our setup at Fireworks was probably the most like leaning into the framework setup as I've seen so far. Like we heavily lean into sort of like deep server component trees, right? Like don't sort of de-opt immediately to a use client component. But we sort of lean into like only use that when we need it. Absolutely. And like we use like server actions and like forms and I think many ways it's like I was like relearning a lot of the basic HTML things, right? Like HTML form submissions, like input type checkbox submits as on or off and not like true or false. So like all these sort of like these are just basic web things. And so I think that was kind of neat that like our React Server Components sort of brought us a little bit back towards that. Sort of building off of what the web gives us, right? So many people have talked about in the past of like, use the platform. Like I think ironically, those people probably wouldn't agree, but I think ironically, like server components is basically using the platform um, to the best extent. Um, so I don't know. Yeah, I think that was like a really cool experience. I think for us as a team, like I think also it's just like we just like iterated so fast with that setup, and it worked pretty well for us. But obviously, different teams scale differently and like sort of adopt technology differently. So it's it's sort of like it depends case. Yeah, Scott and Dylan, any sort of closing remarks, other thoughts you wanted to cover?
I just want to comment on, like, I think it was like in that, maybe this is more obvious, but when the three people there, you, me, and Ian, have familiarity in doing this in a really large scale place, and then we're just like, oh, we're going to introduce this across a really small repo that we're all like kind of already aligned on how we're doing things. Although there were a lot of new paradigms and a bigger paradigm shift to what we were doing there. Like it was much easier to just adopt it straight up at that scale. Whereas like when you have maybe like 100 or a couple hundred developers that you need to learn this shift and they're relying on the platform team to like teach it, even though it's an open source concept, it's a little bit more of a fluid dynamic situation to work with. So I think just us all having an understanding or kind of alignment and have worked together, empowered our team to be able to move fast and try out all those new things.
I just had like one quick example or point from recent experience with server components, where like my team decided like we're gonna just do server components everything all the way down. We're gonna try to just be server component first in our development. And one of the examples is you would click an option on a product display page. It would set a query parameter, and then the server would react to that query parameter re-render. And I found it to be like it's fine on a really fast connection, but you are making a server hop just to update based on an option. And then everything worked great locally. And then we deployed this to Cloudflare, um, we ran into issues where like it would just blow up. And I think this is sort of an issue with some hosting, like cloud hosting adapters for Next.js don't support everything, and it's not always clear what they support and what they don't. So we're in the midst of like trying to adopt OpenNext Cloudflare's adapter, or potentially decide to just like give in and use Vercel. So that's something I've seen with server components is not every hosting environment out of the box will support every feature that you think you like you should be able to use. And so it can be a bit like confusing.
Yeah, I agree. Like this is like it, I've been intentionally moving off of Vercel, and I originally wanted to keep using Next, but like the story of using Next on Cloudflare, which is like in my mind, it was just like a nice to have, just because it like seemed like sort of the best offering of like sort of free server opportunity versus like deploying on Render or Railway or Fly or whatever. Just like yeah, using Next on Cloudflare just came with so many caveats that I've like moved most of my apps over to Waku at this point. But yeah, yeah. Should we jump into our spicy takes?
Absolutely. And I want to just stress this. We do have the spiceometer that we need to use to rank the takes. I have a picture of all the spices or the Taco Bell spices. Are they spices? Salsa packets on my screen so I can tell you it's mild, hot, fire, Diablo. All right.
All right, who wants to go first?
I mean, I have one. I have one. I'm happy to go. Do you folks want me to go
Go
first?
for it, Scott.
All right, so this is a mild take between the three of us, but I feel like it's got some spice out there to other developers. Maybe it doesn't anymore, but I'm going to give a quick round of context. So we've used Storybook here at, the three of us use Storybook at Wayfair. We use Storybook here at Airbnb. A lot of people think you could
I feel
just
sorry for
move
you.
your design system into its. I feel sorry for me. A lot of people think you could just move your design system into Storybook and like that's good enough. And basically, my hot take is Storybook for design systems, Storybook for UI libraries is hot trash. And again, I know this is a mild take between the three of us, but let me just explain a little bit longer. Something I've noticed with Storybook here is, yeah, we have it for like every UI library. They all live in one big storybook. You can basically switch between storybooks. The storybook doesn't give you a path on how to use anything. It's just like, here's a panel and you can configure the crap out of it. Here's the code. Here's like an example of what it can do. So it's really on the user to actually care about it and build stories and write about those stories. And it does not incentivize that. Whereas for example, the Wayfair design system, we used to govern it. We used to write use cases that we expected you to use. We had prop trees already there. Yeah, maybe Storybook has these features, but no one owns and governs it. It's hot trash. It does not help you figure anything out. Having 1,000 props on something that could do anything, especially ones that configure each other, does not help an engineer spend 45 minutes learning how to do it specific use cases that are catered to you. So there's value in having a better mechanism to do it. Storybook is just a mechanism that gives you maybe all of the tools but doesn't configure it, and people treat it like it's a replacement for a team of folks who tell you this is how you govern and use our tools. So I know this is a mild take between the three of us. I know we've talked about
Yeah.
Storybook before, but it's been top of mind lately, and I do think it's kind of it. Storybook is like does seem like the de facto go-to solution in this space, and I think it should be challenged. I think you guys probably feel that way. I think this is at least a hot take in front end, but here I know it's mild, so I'm done.
Dylan, what's your rating of that?
I'll give it a hot take in in that I don't really know what people are using otherwise. And if you're saying this is hot trash, like what's not hot trash as an option? And is it just building your own little in-house component like library website like we did at Wayfair? Is that like the most recommended way approach to this is just kind of like set up your own thing and that way you can get all the information architecture for your design system built the way that makes the most sense for your company? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I guess yes and no. Like I mean, like any markdown solution, any like quick doc solution is better. I just think that the way Storybook presents itself as like a way to create things, the API isn't driven in such a way that it pushes the user to really think through what they're building, but rather it just presents it. We've got a story and there's no governance to it. Whereas when you actually have like dedicated folks who own this part, like it packages away the need to own this by a team. And it's just like, well, it's all here, but nobody looks at all the things of value that it should provide, or at least in the examples I've seen. Like, sure, we've had stories at Wayfair where it's like, here's a bunch of use cases and story names, but nobody wants to write about like when you would use A or B. We make these kitchen sink things where you can turn knobs on, but those don't do like what we did at on Homebase at Wayfair, where it was like, this prop has these options and this is when you use it. Like, it doesn't teach or push the user to document the API in a way that a first time user can just look at it and understand and go through a flow. What it does is it gives you the kitchen sink of options, and it puts the onus on the team to figure out how to do that. And what we need is a path that allows you to go like straight down and make it easier for a first time user. So maybe Storybook can be that, but I don't think right now it presents that.
You can tell that you're passionate about this, Scott. I feel like we just got teleported into a different dimension, and we're in the design systems part 2 episode of the podcast.
Well, I like how this is
The coffee's kicking in.
the spicy takes section
Go ahead.
basically just Scott rants for an hour, and then we try to cut it down to fit it into the episode.
It was 4 minutes. It was 4 minutes.
But it felt
That's
like
yeah. After the cut, yeah, it felt like an hour. I was to say, you were saying like there's no alternative storybook. I think it's just like Shadcn. Just point to the Shadcn docs. There you go. There's your storybook. Done. Problem solved. No, that's
don't go
yeah.
back to this.
I think my rating of your hot take,
And
though,
we wonder
Scott.
why the web sucks.
I think your take is
go
about
ahead.
as spicy as white bread soaked in lukewarm milk. I think that's about as spicy as it is.
on a spicy scale, it's just Taco Bell. We're sponsored.
We're sponsored, yeah.
It's just that great minds think alike, Matt. You just
Doesn't-
agree with
doesn't
me.
Taco
You
Bell-
just know that I'm right.
Doesn't Taco Bell give you like ranch now as an option? So like maybe that's the spice of your take.
Salsa verde, boys. Breakfast salsa.
All right. Who else has a hot take? Dylan, do you have a hot take? You want me to go?
Yeah. I'll give it a hot take real quick. My hot take is that in the last like 5 to 10 years, React and Next and all these frameworks have added so many new features that most of the community doesn't know how to use, and now we're in a spot where I don't know, people don't know what the hell they're doing. And maybe that's just engineers that I've worked with. Maybe I'm calling them out, but they don't have the proper they're not re-educating themselves on new things coming out. So I feel like, I don't know, we're in a weird spot where we have all these great tools, but nobody knows how to use them. So it's a bit of a mess.
I just agree with that take. So
So it's
I mean, I again, like if we step back,
it's not there's no scale. It's just mild.
Just true or false?
no, I feel like if we step out of the context of the three of us who just align on all this, I guess you could say that's a hot take. Like, I agree. It ain't the Diablo take Matt's been brewing since 5 a.m. when he woke up for his coding shift. But like, I do agree that there's just so many tools coming at you. But I just have to say this. I feel like it comes from stems from like, we're gonna give you all these tools. You figure out how to use them. Is like the new way React teaches, and I think that causes folks not to want to try. I don't know. Like Matt has instilled. Okay, we can't turn this into another Matt glazing episode, but Matt has instilled in us to like try APIs, try to understand when you might use a thing, look into what it's for. But like, I can't stress enough that like every engineer needs to just try something. They need to spend an hour on Saturday saying they're going to try some API they've never used, so they can find a use case for it. Hot take, Dylan. I love it.
Yeah, I mean,
Try something.
I think this is why I always say, like, I think fuck around, find out is like should be everyone's life motto. Like you should be messing around with new things and learning. That's not my hot take, though. My hot take is that RSCs are actually good. I think, which is maybe odd to hear in this episode. I think like because we've been kind of glazing the concept of RSCs the whole time, but I think a lot of people saw React Server components and said, "This is trash. I don't want to do this. I want to go back to client-side rendered apps with Vite." I think actually RSCs are like worth it. Like I think more teams should adopt them. That's my hot take. But along with that, I think you should adopt them, but don't use Next. I think that's maybe the lukewarm side of the take for at least the three of us.
I feel like that was the hotter thing you said. It's so funny. You just we're all of. I don't even know how to rank this take. I'll give you a hot take. Yeah, don't use Next, especially if you're at Wayfair. You should actively
Move off of
be
Next.
writing.
Yeah.
Yes, you should be actively pushing for any other framework, and that's what you should be pushing for a promotion. Yair,
God.
I know you're listening. Just be like, why are we using this?
Yeah.
Come up with an alternative solution and tell them that we're doing
You're gonna
it.
get a cease and desist
Exactly.
from Wayfair after this episode.
Well, we're giving them so many
I
good
thought we already
ideas.
did.
True.
We are. Dude, we're giving them free work. This is free
I feel
labor.
like most people would think what you said is a hot take, Matt, but I don't think it is. I feel like any new like large change to the way we do things is always met with like outrage, and then people sort of
Mhm.
see its benefits over time, and changes are made to it based on people's reactions, so it gets better usually.
Yeah, I agree with Dylan. Like, I do think there was a lot of pushback at first. I remember like, Tanstack was like, well, we're client side first and we believe in client side. And then I don't know what happened to Remix or React Router or whatever we're going to call it again. But I do think there was early pushback, and it was like this. I think I heard, oh, this is why we've been taking a slow, cautious approach to implementing React Server components in Remix/React Router 18, 7, whatever version we're on. I think a lot of people have been like, oh, skeptical about it, but I do think it's starting to marinate that like, hey, this is becoming the standard, the early pushback. But yeah, I still think it's kind of a hot take because I don't know. I think the whole reason we did this episode is I don't think people know like what is the like. We just want one recommended path approach with maybe some nuance we can engineers can make and just be like, this is how you should adopt it. And we're not really seeing that anymore.
Yeah, maybe my hot take should have been you should be using Parcel's RSC integration. Maybe that should have been the hot take. But or also like, and maybe this is down a sidetrack. Maybe we cut this from the episode. But I like how the remix team were like, hey, like instead of building like a good framework, let's just go back to basics and build something that's complete trash and it's complete like LLM only centric solution, which is basically what they're building with Remix v3. They're saying we don't want to bundle anymore. We want to use the basics of the web platform. We're going to make your application slower because of it, and they're just leaning into that. They've gone off the rails.
Wild.
It's wild. Yeah.
You just
Yeah.
I like lost context.
I was gonna say that's the best hot take we've had is just blasting some like out in the wild, calling them out. That's Diablo.
It's crazy too because they were like they were loved by the industry, but I think they're gonna go.
Yeah.
They're on their villain arc. People are gonna hate them.
But they've just 360'd around the concept of React Server components and like they were building a framework to compete with Next. And then they're, like I don't want to call anyone out specifically, but I was like, there's all these tweets about this is why we haven't implemented RCS yet. And like, we're working on it. And then the most recent thing I heard is like, we're no longer Remix, we're React Router again. And I was like, I don't know what's going on, man.
Well, I think the interesting part also is that those two guys, we're putting them on blast, but I don't want to say their name. But they basically
we're not.
They basically didn't have anything to do with the RSC integration for React Router v7, as far as I can tell. It was done by like other people on the team, and so it's like hilarious that everyone's like tagging them and like, what's going on with this? And it's like they haven't really been doing it. So I don't know.
I mean, you just totally put them on blast. I mean, let's just say they've done some great work in the past with React Router. It was a great paradigm when it was great. I just honestly was expecting to see like a real. I don't know. I feel like I got hyped up to a real next competitor from them, and then I was going to try it out when I started at Tollbit, and then I pushed it off, and now I feel like it's died, and I got to get caught up in all the drama that Matt just like kind of unleashed here, and I'm still
Yeah, I think
still pontificating. That's not the right word. Apperceiving, I guess, what he just said.
Well, I think Tanner Lindsley with TanStack just came in and ate their lunch and like provided a far better
He did.
client-side React environment ecosystem that everyone latched onto. But anyway, maybe we should have saved this for a different
100%.
episode.
Oh yeah,
But
Let's
we need
do
an
that.
episode
All
on
right.
whether we should use React Query, or TanStack Query.
yeah,
Yeah, we should talk about that. We're a little bit behind syntax on that one, but we should.
They
All
talk
right.
about
Maybe we can get Tanner on too. Maybe we can get syntax and
the whole,
Tanner on
yeah, all of them. And
All
those
of
other
them.
at the same time.
and the React Router team
those
and
other guys.
yeah.
We're just gonna start an internet brawl.
All right. All right. We've been ranting for maybe far too long. Let's quickly do our stand up. Try to keep it short. Don't go on a rant. Hint, Scott. Don't go on a rant.
Shots fired, dude.
All right. Dylan, stand up update. What have you done in the last week? What shareholder value have you delivered in the last week?
Oh, I was just gonna give personal updates because I give
Go
stand
for
up
it.
work.
That's fine.
Recently started trying out this product called Stelo, Stelo, from a company called Dexcom, Dexcom, and it's a continuous glucose monitor. I've had issues in the past with migraines, which I think are caused by like a form of hypoglycemia, which means my blood sugar can tank and I don't have it, like my appetite doesn't kick in, and next thing you know, I have a migraine that literally ends my day. I can't work. And it's been super helpful to be able to know my glucose levels. Yeah, so really cool. Hopefully, I don't have to like wear this the rest of my life to like keep this like from happening, but it's been super helpful to understand like how different foods affect my sugar levels. Yeah, so it's super cool. And then other stand update, I'm
Wow.
getting over a cold this week, but yeah, happy to be almost over that crap.
I think the former really explains your docile attitude sometimes.
Dude, like I don't get hungry sometimes and like I don't know why I'm feeling bad and then all of a sudden I've had it get really bad. Like where my hands have gone numb, my face went numb. It's scary. So like being able
Crazy.
to understand your health better is super, super important. Yeah, try to follow that.
All right. Yeah, no, that's sad. That's really sad, but I'm
It
gonna
wasn't meant to be
bullet list
sad.
my
It was
stuff.
meant to be like a happy thing that
Uplifting.
I'm
Well,
learning with myself, even though I'm 35 years old and I'm still improving myself.
Dylan Downer back
that
at
is
it.
uplifting.
Sad part is over.
Spicy take, Dylan. Sleepyhead. All right. So, life update. My groomsmen, one of them is Matt, are getting our suits this weekend for our wedding. All right, that's enough
For your
about
wedding,
that.
not our wedding.
Oh yeah, sorry, Freudian slip. Matt and I aren't getting married yet. It's my wedding. Enough I'll say about that. We got to move on. Shareholder value. We've been migrating off of Datadog to, an internal system called Telescope, but it's powered by Grafana monitors.
Shout out to
Learned a lot
Eric
about that.
at Grafana.
What?
Shout out to Eric. at
Oh
Grafana.
yeah, Eric Jacobson. Shout out Eric. I just immediately went to Hermanson. I was so lost. All right, yeah. So actually, I had to bite my tongue on. I was like, you cannot message Eric about how to use a Grafana monitor. That is not okay. There are docs for a reason. Okay, so delivered zero shareholder value with that, but I'm trying, and we'll be working on the visual diff for a long time. Stay tuned. I'm done. Matt.
Yeah, I've been I've been in this migration, like LYAML migration, translation migration pit for the past few weeks. It feels like it just keeps going on. It's just, I don't know. I feel like I haven't been productive. So I haven't delivered any shareholder value. Hopefully my manager doesn't hear me say that. No, I'm joking.
I'm sending this directly to Andrew.
No, I think it's been good.
We save these
Yeah.
updates for the end. So if you can self
So we can cut it.
None of your managers made it to the end, so it's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Only Yair's making it to the end.
Let's see. And then outside of that, yeah, like I've been messing around with Parcels RSC integration, which I know we talked a little bit about, but like it's pretty cool. It's pretty dope. And then Redwood SDK is like another RSC integration that I messed around with just last night to build like a quick little to-do demo app, which we'll link in the show notes. But that's pretty cool too. It's a pretty neat take on server component setup, and it's like completely Cloudflare native. It's like support for D1, durable objects, like everything else under the sun, which is pretty dope. Yeah, I think that's about it. Just wanted to, another reminder that if you enjoy this episode or episodes like this, share this with your friends. That's how we get most of our listeners. Join our Discord community where you can talk about the episode and with other people that enjoy the show. Also, we had some like pretty good conversations that I think have spurred some topics that we'll cover in the future. And yeah, I think that's about it. Peace out.
Give us feedback. We'll shout you out in the episode. If we haven't shouted you out yet,
yeah,
let us know in the Discord.
And we'll
shout you out.
We'll give you Bikeshed merch, Bikeshed pod merch when we make it.
Coming soon.
Within the next 10 years.
We'll make it. We'll get some t-shirts and some markers, and we'll send you some merch.
Yeah. All right. See you guys next week, maybe.
Peace.
Yeah. See ya then.